The streets of New York in the early 20th century were alive with a dangerous rhythm, a heartbeat of survival that pulsed through crowded tenements, smoky speakeasies, and shadowed alleys. Immigrant families crowded into cramped apartments, struggling against poverty, disease, and prejudice. For the children born into this world, the line between opportunity and peril was razor-thin. Among them was Charles Lucky Luciano, a boy who would grow up to become the architect of modern organized crime, a man whose name would echo far beyond the city's boroughs and into the annals of criminal legend. The city was unforgiving, and it demanded cunning, ruthlessness, and vision from anyone who wished to rise above the chaos. Luciano's world was one of contrasts, bright lights and dark corners, promise and despair, loyalty and betrayal. He was the product of an environment that bred both desperation and ingenuity. In the Lower East Side, Italian immigrants clung tightly to family, faith, and tradition, yet the streets demanded more than morality, it demanded power. Young boys learned quickly that the playgrounds could double as training grounds for street fights, and petty theft could be a stepping stone to influence. Violence was ubiquitous, but so too were lessons in strategy, negotiation, and survival. In this crucible, Luciano began to understand the intricate dance between fear and respect, between opportunity and danger. Even as a child, Luciano displayed a restless intelligence. He watched the older boys, the petty criminals, and the street bosses, observing not just their actions but the patterns beneath them, the alliances formed and broken in an instant, the unspoken rules that governed who would thrive and who would fail. It was a world governed not by law, but by instinct, reputation, and carefully calculated moves. Luciano learned to read people, to sense weakness and strength, and to anticipate betrayal. The seeds of his future empire were sown in these early lessons, a combination of courage, calculation, and a willingness to act decisively where others hesitated. But it was not merely survival that drove him. There was ambition, a hunger for more than the limits of his neighborhood could offer. He dreamed not just of wealth or comfort, but of a kind of power that transcended fear, a system in which loyalty could be structured, opportunities could be seized systematically, and influence could be extended far beyond the streets of New York. Luciano was fascinated by the notion that the chaos surrounding him could be controlled, that crime could be turned into a business, organized with precision, strategy, and vision. This was a radical idea in a city where crime was fragmented, violent, and largely reactive. By his teenage years, Luciano had already begun to carve a reputation. He was known for his daring, his quick mind, and his ability to navigate the treacherous social currents of the underworld. He was both admired and feared, a combination that would follow him throughout his life. Friends and enemies alike recognized that he was not merely another street thug. He was someone who could plan ahead, who could manipulate circumstances to his advantage, and who could command loyalty without resorting to brute force alone. His charm was subtle but compelling, a tool he wielded as effectively as any weapon, blending persuasion with intimidation, trust with calculated risk. The city itself seemed to conspire with him. New York was undergoing seismic changes. Immigration waves, industrial growth, and prohibition-era policies that inadvertently created immense opportunities for those willing to exploit them. Bootlegging, gambling, and other illegal enterprises offered the young Luciano a chance not just to survive, but to rise. Each alleyway and backroom transaction was a lesson in human psychology, a glimpse into the potential of organized influence. Luciano understood that power was never static, that the underworld was a chessboard where every piece, every alliance, and every betrayal could shift the balance. As the narrative of his life begins, it is tempting to see Luciano as simply a criminal, a man defined by lawlessness and greed. But to do so is to miss the complexity that made him unique. He was a strategist, a psychologist, and a visionary shaped by hardship but driven by an instinct to dominate. He understood fear, loyalty, and ambition not as abstract concepts, but as tools to be wielded, honed, and leveraged. In many ways, his genius lay not in violence itself, but in his ability to structure, systematize, and predict it. He recognized patterns in chaos, order in disorder, and opportunity in the midst of risk. By the time he reached adulthood, the foundations of a vast, interconnected network were already forming in his mind. He saw the potential to unite fractured gangs, to transform violent street conflicts into structured, profitable enterprises, and to craft an empire that would survive beyond the lifespan of any individual. It was the combination of personal ambition, environmental awareness, and strategic insight that set him apart from every other figure of his era. In these formative years, Lucky Luciano was no longer just a street kid. He was a force in waiting, a man whose influence would one day stretch across cities, continents, and decades, leaving a legacy as enduring as it was notorious. The story that follows is not just the chronicle of criminal exploits, it is the story of human complexity, ambition, and the dark brilliance of a man who understood that power is more than muscle. It is the tale of how one boy from the crowded streets of New York could envision a network so vast, so enduring, that even after his fall, the web he spun would never truly unravel. New York at the turn of the 20th century was a city of contrasts: opulence and squalor, opportunity and desperation, law and lawlessness. Its skyline was rising, fueled by industrial expansion, but its streets were crowded with immigrants fighting to survive. Italian, Irish, Jewish, and other communities carved out their own enclaves, each bringing culture, tradition, and a fierce sense of identity, but also friction, competition, and inevitable tension. In these neighborhoods, opportunity was scarce, and ambition was often measured in cunning, street knowledge, and the willingness to bend, or break, the rules. The underworld thrived in this environment, chaotic, fragmented, and dominated by disparate gangs with no central authority. Before Lucky Luciano, the city's criminal ecosystem was a patchwork of turf wars, petty rackets, and violent disputes. Italian gangs, for example, were splintered and often led by older, traditional figures who adhered rigidly to codes that were at once outdated and rigidly enforced. Violence was personal, impulsive, and often brutal, with little regard for long-term strategy. Loyalty was often a fleeting commodity, dependent on proximity and immediate advantage rather than calculated allegiance. Murder, extortion, and robbery were common currencies of power, but few men could translate fear into influence or turn chaos into opportunity. The underworld lacked vision. It was reactive rather than proactive, a constant dance of survival against both rivals and the encroaching hand of the law. In the absence of centralized control, criminal enterprises were inefficient. Protection rackets overlapped, smuggling routes clashed, and internal betrayals were frequent. Street bosses operated like isolated warlords, each defending their patch of the city fiercely, but rarely coordinating with others in any meaningful way. Law enforcement, corrupt and under-resourced, often contributed to the instability rather than resolving it. The result was a vicious cycle. Violence begot violence, distrust begot betrayal, and ambition without foresight often led to ruin. For an ambitious mind like Luciano's, this was both a danger and an opportunity. The chaos revealed weaknesses to exploit and gaps to fill, hinting at a vision of order where none existed. The Prohibition era, beginning in 1920, acted as a catalyst for this transformation. With alcohol banned nationwide, lucrative opportunities emerged for those daring enough to defy the law. Yet the spoils of bootlegging were largely scattered among isolated gangs, many of whom operated without coordination, efficiency, or security. Violence surged as rivalries intensified over distribution territories. Traditional mob bosses struggled to adapt to the new scale and complexity of criminal enterprise. The city needed organization, strategy, and foresight, qualities that were rare in a world still dominated by instinct and brute force. This was the world Luciano inherited, a city teetering on the edge of disorder, where ambition collided with chaos. While many young men sought temporary gains through violence or petty crime, Luciano saw the potential for something far larger. He envisioned a system where violence could be contained, alliances could be negotiated, and criminal enterprise could be managed like a legitimate business. The fragmented gangs, the constant betrayals, the unpredictable enforcement by the police, all of it presented opportunities for a mind capable of long-term thinking. Where others saw danger, he saw leverage. Where others saw chaos, he saw structure waiting to be built. Yet the streets themselves were a harsh teacher. New York was unforgiving, and mistakes were punished quickly and often permanently. Rival gangs did not forgive or forget, and law enforcement, though inconsistent, could strike with devastating effect when opportunity presented itself. For young mobsters, the margin for error was slim. Every misstep carried consequences: a lost alliance, a wounded reputation, or even death. The underworld demanded not only courage but intelligence, foresight, and psychological acuity. Luciano's early observations in this environment allowed him to learn how to manipulate fear, respect, and loyalty, tools that would later become the foundation of his empire. Beyond the streets, the social fabric of New York offered both constraint and leverage. Immigrant communities were tightly knit, but those ties could be exploited. Family loyalty, religious devotion, and community networks provided protection and support, yet they also created obligations and expectations. Luciano learned to navigate these networks carefully, understanding that influence extended beyond violence. Money, reputation, charm, and strategic marriages could all be used to consolidate power in ways that brute force never could. The key was to balance visible authority with subtle manipulation, to command both fear and respect, and to ensure loyalty through a combination of reward, persuasion, and deterrence. The city's underworld also reflected the wider social tensions of the era. Class divisions, ethnic rivalries, and rapid urbanization created instability that could be exploited. Politicians and police were often corrupt, relying on bribes or selective enforcement, which meant that the criminal world operated in a parallel ecosystem with its own rules. For a visionary like Luciano, these conditions were the perfect proving ground. He could observe patterns, identify opportunities for unification, and experiment with strategies that would later define modern organized crime. The chaotic landscape was not just a backdrop, it was an active participant, shaping behavior, testing alliances, and revealing both the fragility and potential of the underworld. In many ways, the period before Luciano's rise was a story of unrealized potential. Violence dominated, but vision was absent. Loyalty existed, but it was fleeting. Opportunity was abundant, but unstructured. It was a city crying out for order within chaos, for strategy within anarchy, and for a mind capable of converting fear into influence. Luciano would become that mind. By understanding both the weaknesses and the possibilities inherent in New York's criminal ecosystem, he positioned himself not merely as a participant in the underworld, but as a revolutionary figure who could reshape it entirely. The pre-Luciano era of New York was one of fragmentation, brutality, and unpredictability, a world in which survival was measured daily and alliances shifted like sand. It was the perfect stage for the emergence of a man who would not only navigate this chaos but also impose his own vision upon it. The story of organized crime as we know it begins not with Lucky Luciano's first arrest or his eventual empire, but in the disordered streets that taught him the rules, the risks, and the possibilities. It was a world waiting for a strategist, and he would not disappoint. Luciano's childhood was steeped in struggle, shaped by the crowded tenements and narrow streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side. Born in 1897 to Italian immigrant parents, he inherited both the resilience and the burdens of his family's history. Life was not easy. The neighborhood was a battleground of poverty, illness, and competition, where every day demanded ingenuity and courage just to survive. The environment forced him to mature quickly, to read people before they acted, and to recognize opportunity wherever it might appear, even amid hardship. Every alleyway and cramped apartment offered lessons in negotiation, observation, and the subtle arts of influence, skills that would later define his approach to power. From an early age, Luciano displayed a restless intelligence and a natural curiosity about the world around him. Unlike many boys who succumbed to their circumstances, he watched and learned, absorbing not only the behavior of peers but also the underlying patterns of the streets. He noticed how some men commanded loyalty and fear simultaneously, how alliances could be fleeting, and how one wrong decision could lead to permanent consequences. These observations were not theoretical for him, they were survival mechanisms. He began to develop a sense of strategy long before he would earn his reputation as a master tactician, understanding that influence often mattered more than brute strength, and that respect had to be earned and maintained with care. Education offered little relief from the harsh realities outside the classroom. Schools were overcrowded and teachers were often overwhelmed or indifferent. Luciano was bright, but the structured lessons of literacy and arithmetic mattered less than the streetwise education he received daily. The hierarchies of the neighborhood, the local gangs, the protective networks of families, the unspoken codes of conduct, taught him lessons that no textbook could offer. He learned the value of timing, the power of reputation, and the importance of building relationships, even with those who seemed his enemies. These formative experiences laid the groundwork for the psychological understanding that would later allow him to manipulate rivals, allies, and the law alike. By the time he reached his teenage years, Luciano was already testing boundaries, drawn toward petty crime as both a means of survival and an avenue for proving himself. Small-time thefts, fights, and daring escapades earned him a reputation among his peers. But there was more to him than mere bravado. He exhibited a keen ability to assess risk, predict outcomes, and exploit weaknesses. This was not reckless impulsivity, it was calculation disguised as audacity. Others might see only the flash of courage or the thrill of confrontation, but Luciano was already practicing the psychological and strategic skills that would later define his empire. Family life was another crucible shaping his character. While his parents provided guidance and stability, they could not shield him from the harsh realities of the streets. Loyalty to family became an early lesson in negotiation and responsibility, a lesson in balancing personal ambition with obligations to others. Luciano learned that survival depended not only on physical strength but also on understanding human nature, on reading desires, fears, and motives. These early lessons instilled in him a duality that would characterize much of his later life, a capacity for both deep loyalty and ruthless calculation, a combination that would allow him to build and maintain a vast criminal network. Luciano's first encounters with the more organized elements of the underworld began in adolescence. He gravitated toward older, more experienced figures who recognized his intelligence and daring. Under their guidance, he gained insight into the mechanics of organized crime, how alliances were brokered, how disputes could be resolved without unnecessary bloodshed, and how strategic violence could serve as a tool rather than a liability. He observed the strengths and weaknesses of older mob bosses, noting their tendency toward rigidity, impulsiveness, and short-term thinking. From these observations, he began to envision a different approach, one that combined organization, foresight, and strategic manipulation. Even as a young man, Luciano displayed a rare combination of charisma and psychological acuity. He understood that fear and respect were not always sufficient to maintain control. Influence required persuasion, charm, and careful orchestration of perception. He cultivated relationships selectively, aligning himself with figures who could enhance his position while remaining aware of potential threats. Every interaction was a lesson in human behavior, a rehearsal for the complex negotiations and betrayals that would define his later career. In these formative years, he was learning not only how to survive but how to anticipate, plan, and manipulate events to his advantage. Luciano's environment also offered lessons in patience and timing. The streets of New York demanded an understanding of rhythm: when to act, when to wait, when to escalate conflict, and when to defer. Impulsivity could be fatal. Foresight was essential. He learned to recognize patterns in behavior, both individual and communal, and to exploit opportunities before rivals could react. His early successes were not spectacular or violent. They were subtle, incremental gains in influence, trust, and reputation. These small victories built the foundation for the larger structures he would eventually impose upon the chaotic world of organized crime. As he moved toward adulthood, the combination of environment, intellect, and ambition set Luciano apart. He was not merely a product of circumstance. He was a shaper of circumstance. The streets had taught him the language of survival, but he sought to convert that survival into power, influence, and eventually an enduring empire. While others remained trapped in cycles of violence, he envisioned a new order, one in which crime could be systematized, alliances negotiated strategically, and the chaos of the city harnessed for profit and control. By the end of his teenage years, Luciano was no longer just another street kid. He had learned the critical lessons of observation, loyalty, psychology, and strategy. He had tasted power in small doses, understood its fragility, and recognized the necessity of foresight. The Lower East Side, with all its chaos and hardship, had forged him into a young man capable of not only surviving the underworld but of reshaping it entirely. The foundations of the modern mafia, organization, psychological insight, and strategic control, were already taking root in his mind, waiting for the moment to be realized. Luciano's early life, then, was a crucible of survival, intelligence, and ambition. It was in these formative years that he honed the skills, instincts, and psychological acumen that would allow him to rise above the chaos of New York's underworld. The story of his ascent is not merely one of crime. It is a story of vision, strategy, and the emergence of a mind capable of seeing patterns where others saw only disorder. It is the story of a street kid who understood, even before adulthood, that true power lies not in fear alone, but in foresight, influence, and the ability to turn chaos into opportunity. By the time Luciano reached his late teens, he had already begun to navigate the complex social landscape of the New York underworld, a world of opportunity shadowed by danger. He recognized that raw talent and courage were not enough to survive in the streets. Influence required alliances, partnerships, and a deep understanding of human psychology. Luciano's earliest forays into organized crime were carefully calculated, a combination of observation, experimentation, and instinct. He sought out mentors and allies who could teach him the mechanics of power, show him how to operate in the gray spaces between legality and lawlessness, and introduce him to the networks that would later define his empire. The early alliances Luciano forged were as much about learning as they were about survival. He gravitated toward experienced figures who had established control over small territories, who managed gambling dens, protection rackets, and illicit trades with precision. These older gangsters recognized his intelligence and audacity and saw potential in the young man who was both ambitious and shrewd. Luciano absorbed their methods, watching how they negotiated disputes, maintained loyalty and wielded both fear and charm. But he also observed their weaknesses: impulsiveness, inflexibility, and a tendency to rely solely on violence. Lessons he would internalize as he began to form his own vision for a more strategic, controlled criminal enterprise. One of Luciano's earliest allies was a man who embodied both opportunity and risk, a seasoned criminal whose networks extended beyond the Lower East Side into other boroughs and communities. Through this relationship, Luciano learned the intricacies of negotiation and the subtleties of influence. He discovered that alliances were rarely permanent and that every partnership carried both potential gain and hidden peril. A misstep could lead to betrayal, while a well-timed gesture of loyalty could cement trust for years. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to weigh these risks carefully, to anticipate reactions, and to position himself advantageously without appearing overtly ambitious, a skill that would define his interactions for decades to come. During this period, Luciano also began to cultivate a network of peers who shared his ambition and understood the dynamics of the streets. These young men were not merely followers; they were collaborators, each bringing unique skills and connections to the table. Together they experimented with small-scale operations, protection rackets, illicit gambling and bootlegging ventures, that allowed them to test their abilities and build reputations. Luciano's leadership emerged not from force alone but from a combination of strategy, personal charisma, and the ability to inspire loyalty. He learned to motivate others by offering both opportunity and security, creating a sense of shared purpose even in the inherently unstable world of crime. It was in these early collaborations that Luciano began to see the potential for a radically different kind of organization. While other gangsters relied primarily on intimidation and reactive violence, he imagined a system in which alliances could be formalized, disputes resolved without unnecessary bloodshed, and criminal enterprise managed like a legitimate business. This vision required careful observation, negotiation skills, and the patience to build trust incrementally. Luciano's first alliances were the testing ground for these ideas, allowing him to understand the delicate balance between loyalty and self-interest, between fear and respect. At the same time, the young Luciano was learning the value of strategic restraint. While many contemporaries sought immediate gains through reckless action, he recognized that long-term influence demanded patience and careful calculation. He studied the dynamics of power, observing which behaviors earned loyalty, which actions provoked resentment, and which methods created enduring stability. This understanding of human behavior allowed him to manipulate perceptions subtly, presenting himself as both trustworthy and formidable, approachable yet untouchable. His early alliances were thus as much psychological experiments as they were operational partnerships, training him to read people and circumstances with remarkable acuity. The environment of the Lower East Side also taught Luciano that influence extended beyond immediate allies. Relationships with rival factions, corrupt officials, and community leaders were equally crucial. He learned to navigate these networks discreetly, establishing channels of communication that could be leveraged in times of conflict or opportunity. Even as a young man, he understood that every connection, however minor it seemed, had potential strategic value. His early alliances were not isolated. They were part of a growing web of influence, each thread carefully chosen, tested, and maintained. These formative partnerships also exposed Luciano to the darker realities of the criminal world: betrayal, greed, and the precariousness of trust. He witnessed firsthand the consequences of impulsive action and the fragility of alliances built solely on fear. He learned that loyalty could be cultivated through respect, opportunity, and psychological insight rather than mere coercion. This understanding allowed him to develop a leadership style that was both flexible and authoritative, one capable of inspiring loyalty while maintaining control over complex networks of people and operations. By the end of this period, Luciano's early alliances had achieved several critical outcomes. They provided him with practical experience in managing operations, negotiating conflicts, and understanding the intricacies of loyalty and power. They also allowed him to begin constructing a mental blueprint for the modern mafia, one that would combine organizational discipline, psychological insight, and strategic foresight. These initial relationships were the foundation of a network that would eventually span multiple boroughs, involve numerous families, and endure far beyond his own lifetime. In retrospect, these early alliances reveal not only Luciano's ambition but also his innate strategic mind. While others were satisfied with short-term gains or violent displays of dominance, he was learning to think in terms of systems, networks, and enduring influence. Every partnership, every negotiation, and every minor victory contributed to the architecture of a criminal empire unlike any the city had seen before. In these formative years, the young Luciano was not merely surviving. He was quietly building the scaffolding of power, preparing to reshape the underworld according to his vision, and setting the stage for a rise that would alter the landscape of organized crime forever. By the early 1920s, Lucky Luciano had moved beyond the chaotic street-level skirmishes of his youth and was beginning to envision something far greater than mere survival or petty power. He saw the fractured underworld around him, the feuding gangs, disorganized rackets, and erratic violence, as both a problem and an opportunity. While other mobsters were content to claim small patches of territory or maintain influence through fear alone, Luciano perceived a potential for order, structure, and long-term control. He understood that the true power lay not in immediate displays of violence but in the ability to orchestrate alliances, enforce discipline, and integrate disparate factions into a cohesive, interdependent network. The creation of the modern mafia was, in many ways, Luciano's answer to the disorder he had observed since childhood. He recognized that the old system, dominated by impulsive bosses and fragmented crews, was inefficient, vulnerable, and unsustainable. Territorial disputes erupted into deadly wars, and short-sighted rivalries threatened even the most profitable operations. Luciano's vision was revolutionary. He would transform these disjointed groups into a structured, business-like organization governed by rules, agreements, and a centralized council. Power would no longer be a matter of brute force alone. It would be distributed intelligently, with authority delegated according to skill, loyalty, and reliability. Central to this reimagined underworld was the concept of the Commission, a governing body that would mediate disputes, regulate territories, and enforce a code of conduct among the families. Luciano believed that without a central authority, conflict would continue to destroy profits and destabilize operations. The Commission was both a psychological and practical innovation, combining diplomacy with coercion, persuasion with enforceable rules. Through it, Luciano could institutionalize the principles that had guided him personally: calculated risk, strategic alliances, and the careful calibration of loyalty and fear. This was not merely a criminal council. It was the backbone of an entirely new paradigm in organized crime. Building this empire required careful negotiation. Luciano could not simply impose authority, he had to earn it. He brokered alliances with rival bosses, demonstrating both respect and strategic insight. He used his reputation for fairness, combined with subtle intimidation, to persuade others that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. By positioning himself as both mediator and visionary, he cultivated trust among figures who had previously viewed one another with suspicion or outright hostility. Each successful negotiation reinforced his authority, not through terror alone, but through demonstrated competence and the promise of stability. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to synthesize the chaotic energies of the underworld into a functional, profitable system. He understood the strengths of each individual and faction, assigning roles that maximized their talents while minimizing risk. Violent enforcers were given specific operational responsibilities, negotiators handled delicate alliances, trusted lieutenants managed financial flows. By structuring the organization this way, he reduced internal friction, increased efficiency, and created a network that could endure even when leaders were removed by law enforcement or rival factions. The empire he built was resilient because it was decentralized yet coordinated, flexible yet disciplined, a reflection of both his strategic foresight and his understanding of human psychology. Equally important was Luciano's approach to the rules of loyalty and punishment. While fear remained a critical tool, it was now combined with incentive and opportunity. Loyalty could be rewarded with territory, access to profitable operations, and social elevation, while betrayal was met with swift and calculated consequences. In doing so, he created a culture in which allegiance became a rational choice rather than merely a reaction to threat. This subtle manipulation of human motivation marked a radical departure from the brutal, impulsive enforcement methods that had characterized earlier generations of mobsters. The organization Luciano envisioned was also inherently entrepreneurial. He treated illegal enterprises not as chaotic ventures but as structured businesses with calculated risk and predictable returns. Bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering were not merely sources of cash. They were integrated systems, carefully monitored and strategically expanded. Luciano's management style emphasized foresight. He diversified operations, anticipated law enforcement actions, and maintained channels of communication that allowed rapid responses to threats or opportunities. By turning crime into a form of corporate enterprise, he demonstrated both audacity and intelligence, setting the stage for an empire that would endure far longer than any individual's lifespan. Another critical aspect of Luciano's rise was his ability to bridge cultural and ethnic divides within the underworld. Historically, gangs were fragmented along ethnic lines. Italian, Jewish, Irish, and other groups often competed violently rather than cooperating. Luciano recognized that long-term stability and profitability required integration. He built alliances across these lines, fostering a level of cooperation that had previously been unimaginable. This ability to unify diverse factions not only expanded his influence but also created a more resilient network, one in which conflicts could be mediated rather than erupting into destructive wars. Luciano also understood the importance of perception. He cultivated an image of authority that extended beyond immediate operational control. Stories of his cleverness, ruthlessness, and strategic insight spread through the underworld, creating a psychological aura that enhanced his influence. Competitors and allies alike perceived him not simply as a man, but as a force, someone whose vision and intelligence demanded respect. This careful manipulation of reputation amplified his authority, allowing him to exert control with fewer direct confrontations and fewer costly displays of violence. The birth of the modern mafia under Luciano was not an overnight achievement but the result of patient observation, strategic alliance building, and careful application of psychological insight. He transformed a landscape defined by impulsive brutality into a system governed by negotiation, foresight, and structured authority. The networks he created were sophisticated, resilient, and adaptive, capable of surviving both internal and external pressures. Violence remained a tool, but it was subordinated to strategy. Loyalty remained critical, but it was earned and reinforced through rational systems of reward and consequence. By the mid-1920s, Luciano's vision was already taking shape. The foundations of what would become one of the most enduring criminal organizations in history were established. Coordinated families, a governing council, integrated business operations, and an overarching code of conduct. He had achieved what few could: the transformation of chaos into order, the conversion of fear into structured influence, and the creation of a network that could outlast him. This was a new model of crime, one in which intelligence, psychology, and strategic foresight were as important as brute force, and in which the human element, loyalty, trust, and perception, was systematically harnessed to build enduring power. Luciano's genius lay not only in his capacity to dominate the underworld but in his ability to reconceive it entirely. Where others saw gangs and petty rackets, he saw systems, networks, and scalable structures. Where others relied solely on intimidation, he relied on negotiation, persuasion, and strategic foresight. In this way, Luciano was more than a gangster. He was an architect, a strategist, and a revolutionary figure whose influence would shape organized crime not just in New York, but across the world for decades to come. At the heart of Lucky Luciano's empire lay not just strategy, alliances, or territory, but the psychological architecture that held it all together, the Code of Omerta. This was more than a set of rules. It was a philosophy, a doctrine that governed behavior, loyalty, and survival within the mafia. Omerta dictated silence, obedience, and respect, creating a framework in which fear, trust, and honor intersected to form a cohesive system. For Luciano, understanding and enforcing this code was essential. It was the glue that bound his organization together, the invisible force that allowed him to wield influence far beyond his immediate reach. The principles of Omerta were deceptively simple on the surface. Do not cooperate with authorities, protect your associates, and respect the hierarchy. Yet beneath this simplicity lay a complex web of psychological pressure and expectation. Members of the mafia were constantly aware that a single lapse, an indiscretion, a betrayal, or even a moment of weakness, could have catastrophic consequences. Fear alone, however, was insufficient. Loyalty had to be cultivated, trust had to be earned, and respect had to be maintained through a careful balance of rewards and discipline. Luciano mastered this balance, creating a culture in which the code was internalized, not imposed, and in which obedience became rational, even desirable. Luciano's application of Omerta was both practical and psychological. It allowed him to maintain control over a sprawling organization without micromanaging every operation. He relied on reputation, precedent, and carefully managed perception to enforce rules. A story of punishment here, a subtle demonstration of reward there. These gestures were amplified through the network, signaling to associates what was expected and what was forbidden. In this way, he harnessed human psychology, Individuals internalized the consequences of violation and adjusted behavior accordingly. The result was an organization that operated efficiently, cohesively, and predictably, despite the inherently violent and volatile environment in which it existed. The psychological impact of omerta extended beyond mere compliance. It created an intricate system of fear and respect that reinforced hierarchical authority. Members understood that their position, influence, and even survival were tied to adherence to the code. Betrayal was punished not only as a legal or operational violation but as a moral transgression, a breach of the unspoken covenant that sustained the organization. Fear of repercussions was intertwined with shame, guilt, and the understanding that trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. This combination of emotional levers, fear, respect, guilt, and pride, allowed Luciano to govern with remarkable efficiency, minimizing internal conflict while maximizing operational cohesion. Omerta also served a strategic function beyond internal discipline. It protected the organization from external threats, particularly law enforcement and rival gangs. Silence in the face of investigation, deception in negotiations, and secrecy in operations ensured that the mafia could operate with relative impunity. Luciano understood that the credibility of the code itself was a form of power. When outsiders perceived that no one would speak, no one would betray, and every action was carefully calculated, it amplified both the aura and the reach of his influence. The perception of invincibility, rooted in the psychological enforcement of omerta, became as powerful a weapon as any gun or bribe. Yet the enforcement of the code was never purely coercive. Luciano knew that loyalty could not be sustained by fear alone. It had to be cultivated through opportunity, protection, and strategic reward. Promotions, access to profitable ventures, and personal trust were leveraged to reinforce adherence to omerta. This duality, punishment tempered with incentive, created a culture in which obedience was rational and advantageous. Members were not simply coerced, they were subtly manipulated, trained to internalize the rules as if they were their own. This psychological sophistication distinguished Luciano's approach from the brutal, short-sighted methods of earlier gang leaders. The code also shaped interpersonal dynamics within the organization. Trust and discretion became currency, and the most effective leaders were those who could read character, anticipate behavior, and influence outcomes without overt force. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to combine these skills with operational acumen. He understood the personalities within his network, the motivations of his allies, and the vulnerabilities of his rivals. By leveraging the psychological impact of omerta, he maintained control over a complex web of individuals whose interests and ambitions were not always aligned. It was a delicate equilibrium, a constant interplay of power, fear, and respect, maintained through both subtlety and calculated displays of authority. Omerta also shaped Luciano's public persona. While his organization was hidden in shadows, the knowledge that he commanded loyalty and discretion enhanced his mythic status. Stories of silence, betrayal avoided, and punishments administered quietly circulated among both allies and adversaries, creating an aura of invincibility. People respected him not just for his ability to enforce rules, but for his understanding of the human mind, how to manipulate fear, loyalty, and ambition to create predictable, controllable outcomes. In this sense, omerta was as much about perception and psychology as it was about discipline. The code, however, was not without tension. Human nature, ambition, and circumstance constantly threatened its stability. Luciano had to navigate jealousy, rivalries, and shifting alliances, ensuring that the principles of omerta remained effective even as the organization expanded. His success was not inevitable. It required constant vigilance, psychological insight, and adaptive leadership. Mistakes could be fatal, yet his ability to anticipate behavior, enforce subtle consequences, and reward strategic loyalty ensured that the organization remained cohesive and resilient. Ultimately, the Code of Omerta under Luciano became more than a rulebook. It was a philosophy of control, a psychological framework, and a cultural anchor for an entire criminal network. It allowed him to manage chaos, cultivate loyalty, enforce discipline, and project power both internally and externally. Through Omerta, Luciano transformed the mafia from a collection of fragmented gangs into a structured, enduring enterprise, proving that control over human behavior could be as potent as any weapon. It was a testament to his insight into human psychology, his strategic foresight, and his ability to turn fear, respect, and loyalty into the machinery of empire. In this way, Omerta was the invisible architecture of Luciano's power, a silent code that shaped behavior, controlled ambition, and maintained order in a world defined by chaos. It revealed not only his understanding of crime as an enterprise but also his deep comprehension of the human mind, the motivations that drive loyalty and the consequences of betrayal. By mastering the psychology of fear, trust, and respect, Luciano created a network that could endure challenges, survive rivalries, and project influence long beyond the reach of law enforcement or temporary alliances. It was not just a code. It was the backbone of an empire, the hidden force that allowed one man to orchestrate an entire underworld with precision, foresight, and subtlety. With the psychological foundation of loyalty and obedience firmly established through omerta, Lucky Luciano turned his attention to the lifeblood of his empire, the business of crime itself. Unlike the impulsive street bosses who had dominated the underworld before him, Luciano treated illicit activity not as random acts of violence or opportunistic theft, but as a network of organized enterprises, each feeding into the other with efficiency, precision, and foresight. Gambling dens, bootlegging operations, and labor racketeering were not isolated ventures. They were integrated components of a criminal ecosystem that he controlled and optimized. Every operation served multiple purposes: profit generation, influence expansion, and the reinforcement of loyalty and discipline. Bootlegging, in particular, became the centerpiece of Luciano's empire during Prohibition. The nationwide ban on alcohol created a demand that legitimate businesses could not legally meet, leaving a vacuum that criminal enterprises were perfectly positioned to exploit. Luciano recognized the potential immediately. He coordinated production, distribution, and protection with the meticulous attention of a seasoned entrepreneur. Smugglers, bartenders, and speakeasy owners were all carefully managed, either incorporated into his network or replaced with more compliant operators. Territory disputes, which had previously led to violent turf wars, were now negotiated, enforced, and documented through a combination of respect, threat, and shared profit. Bootlegging became more than a source of cash. It was a demonstration of Luciano's ability to orchestrate complex systems, control risk, and maintain loyalty across a sprawling network of associates. Gambling operations offered another avenue for revenue and influence. Betting dens, card rooms, and illegal lotteries flourished under Luciano's oversight. Unlike many of his predecessors, he approached these operations systematically, enforcing rules, mediating disputes, and ensuring the smooth flow of profits. These establishments also served as hubs for intelligence gathering. Through observation and subtle interrogation, Luciano could gauge the loyalty of his associates, the intentions of rivals, and the effectiveness of his enforcement. Gambling was both a business and a psychological tool, allowing him to monitor behavior, reinforce hierarchy, and extend his influence into areas that were previously uncontrolled or fragmented. Labor racketeering represented a more sophisticated and long-term approach to influence and power. Luciano understood that control over unions and labor organizations could generate enormous leverage. Through bribery, intimidation, and strategic placement of loyal operatives, he gained influence over shipping, construction, and dock operations, effectively controlling the movement of goods, contracts, and resources. Labor racketeering provided steady income and allowed him to shape local economies according to his interests. It also reinforced loyalty and dependence within his network, creating relationships that were mutually beneficial but ultimately subordinate to his authority. By controlling these systems, Luciano extended his influence far beyond the immediate reach of his street-level operations, establishing a foundation for an empire that blended crime, business, and social manipulation. Luciano's approach to these enterprises revealed his brilliance in integrating disparate criminal activities into a cohesive, interlocking system. Each operation reinforced the others, creating a feedback loop of power, wealth, and loyalty. Profits from bootlegging funded gambling dens, which in turn financed labor racketeering operations. Alliances forged in one sector could be leveraged in another. Intelligence gathered in speakeasies could inform decisions about territory disputes or union influence. The empire was a living organism, carefully managed and constantly optimized, with Luciano as the unseen hand directing its growth and ensuring its stability. But control was never purely operational, it was also psychological. Luciano understood that the success of these enterprises depended on the perception of authority and the management of human behavior. Associates needed to feel both fear and opportunity, respect and incentive. He employed subtle techniques of reinforcement, rewards for compliance, promotions for initiative, and consequences for failure or disloyalty. Public displays of power were rare but carefully calculated to maximize impact, while the majority of enforcement occurred quietly, through reputation, subtle persuasion, and strategic intervention. In this way, Luciano combined economics with psychology, creating a system that was resilient, adaptable, and intimidating without relying solely on overt violence. Rivalries within the underworld, which had once resulted in chaotic and deadly confrontations, were now managed through negotiation and strategic pressure. Luciano's ability to broker agreements between competing factions reduced unnecessary conflict and increased overall profitability. Territories were divided not arbitrarily but based on mutual recognition of influence, strategic importance, and operational efficiency. These agreements were reinforced through omerta, the psychological architecture that ensured compliance and reduced the risk of betrayal. Violence was no longer random or impulsive. It was a tool applied with precision when necessary to protect profits, enforce loyalty, or eliminate serious threats. The success of these ventures also reinforced Luciano's reputation, both among his allies and his adversaries. He became known as a man who could not only generate extraordinary wealth but also maintain order and predict outcomes in a chaotic and dangerous environment. His influence extended into the political and social fabric of the city, with corrupt officials, union leaders, and business operators all recognizing the benefits of cooperation or the consequences of resistance. Luciano's empire was not just criminal, it was a parallel system of power that operated with sophistication, foresight, and strategic intelligence. By integrating multiple forms of criminal enterprise under a unified system, Luciano transformed the very nature of organized crime in New York. He demonstrated that crime could be managed like a business, with efficiency, scalability, and long-term vision. His methods elevated him above the impulsive street bosses of the past, establishing a blueprint for modern organized crime that would endure for generations. Profits, loyalty, influence, and psychological control were interdependent elements, each reinforcing the other to create an organization that was both formidable and resilient. Through these enterprises, Luciano solidified his power and influence, laying the groundwork for a network that extended beyond immediate operations into every corner of the city's underworld. Bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering were not just profitable ventures, they were instruments of control, loyalty, and perception. They allowed him to shape the behavior of allies and rivals alike, to manage conflicts with precision, and to project authority across a complex and volatile ecosystem. In this way, Luciano's empire of vice was as much about psychology, strategy, and social engineering as it was about money or violence. In retrospect, Luciano's genius lay in his ability to see connections where others saw only chaos, to organize and systematize operations in a way that maximized efficiency, loyalty, and influence. His empire was not built on brute force alone, it was built on insight, foresight, and a deep understanding of human nature. By the mid-1920s, Lucky Luciano had not only secured control over key criminal enterprises but had also created a model of organized crime that would endure, expand, and influence generations of underworld figures around the world. As Luciano's empire expanded, the balance of power in New York's underworld began to shift dramatically. The city's criminal landscape, once fragmented and unpredictable, now revolved increasingly around him. But with great power came inevitable challenges. Rival gangsters, threatened by his vision and influence, began to maneuver against him. Alliances shifted constantly, loyalties were tested, and the stakes of every decision grew higher. For Luciano, survival was no longer merely a matter of skill or cunning. It became a high-stakes game of strategy, perception, and calculated risk. Luciano's genius was in recognizing that power alone was insufficient without alliances. He cultivated relationships with influential figures both inside and outside the Italian mafia. Jewish, Irish, and other ethnic factions, which had historically operated independently or in opposition, became part of his network through careful negotiation, shared profit, and mutual recognition of power. These alliances were not mere conveniences, they were strategic imperatives. By forging cooperative relationships with former rivals, Luciano reduced the likelihood of violent conflict while creating an interdependent network that strengthened his control over the city. Each alliance was a calculated step toward dominance, a thread in the complex web of influence he was weaving across New York. Yet alliances came with inherent risk. Even trusted partners could become threats if ambitions shifted or if loyalty wavered. Luciano understood the psychology of his peers better than most, predicting the impulses of men driven by greed, pride, or vengeance. He cultivated trust carefully, rewarding loyalty generously but making it unmistakably clear that betrayal would be met with swift and decisive action. Reputation, he knew, was as powerful a weapon as any firearm. The fear of consequences, combined with the allure of opportunity, maintained control over both allies and adversaries alike. Among his most notable alliances were relationships with powerful Jewish gangsters, who controlled lucrative rackets in gambling, bootlegging, and labor manipulation. By aligning with these figures, Luciano not only expanded his influence into territories previously dominated by others but also gained access to resources, intelligence, and operational expertise that complemented his own. These partnerships, often brokered over quiet negotiations in dimly lit backrooms or discreet speakeasies, were a delicate dance of trust and leverage. Misstep or misjudgment could result in open conflict, but success solidified Luciano's image as a master strategist and a central figure capable of uniting otherwise fractured factions. Rivalries, however, remained unavoidable. Figures from older Italian gangs loyal to outdated hierarchies viewed Luciano's rise as both a challenge and a threat. They were skilled, experienced, and unafraid of violence, willing to defend territory and reputation with lethal force. Luciano's approach to these adversaries was measured and calculated. He used diplomacy, intimidation, and strategic application of force to neutralize threats without unnecessary escalation. Assassinations were rare and targeted, serving not as impulsive acts of rage but as precise instruments to reshape the balance of power. Through these maneuvers, he demonstrated that his empire was built on intellect, psychology, and foresight rather than mere brute strength. The interplay of allies and enemies created a constantly shifting chessboard, in which Luciano had to anticipate multiple moves ahead. Every alliance carried potential betrayal. Every enemy represented both a threat and an opportunity. He understood that perception was as critical as reality. Rivals needed to see him as untouchable, allies needed to see him as indispensable, and potential adversaries needed to recognize that resistance was both costly and futile. In this environment, the margin for error was slim, yet Luciano navigated it with a combination of patience, intelligence, and an uncanny understanding of human behavior. Betrayal, a constant threat in any criminal network, required particular attention. Luciano knew that even a single act of disloyalty could unravel carefully constructed relationships and destabilize operations. He implemented systems of checks and communication, subtle surveillance, and controlled information flow to detect potential threats before they could materialize. At the same time, he reinforced loyalty through calculated rewards, shared profits, and public recognition of commitment. The interplay of fear, opportunity, and psychological influence created an environment where allegiance became rational, even when moral compunction or personal ambition might tempt a member to defect. Luciano's handling of alliances and rivalries also revealed his exceptional political acumen. He understood the importance of symbolic gestures, reputation management, and public perception. A timely intervention to resolve a dispute, a display of generosity, or a controlled show of power could shift loyalties, intimidate adversaries, and reinforce his authority without resorting to widespread violence. In these interactions, he demonstrated an almost preternatural ability to read people, anticipate actions, and manipulate outcomes, consolidating influence in ways that were invisible to casual observers but devastatingly effective in practice. As his network expanded, the risks multiplied. Rivals could conspire against him, law enforcement could target his operations, and internal tensions could erupt if alliances frayed. Yet Luciano's combination of foresight, psychological insight, and operational discipline allowed him to navigate these dangers with remarkable success. He maintained the loyalty of key lieutenants, brokered agreements between competing factions, and projected authority in a way that minimized overt conflict while maximizing obedience and cooperation. His ability to harmonize the competing interests of a sprawling criminal network was a testament to both his intellect and his strategic vision. By the late 1920s, Luciano had emerged as the central figure in a citywide network of organized crime. His alliances provided resources, intelligence, and influence. His rivals were either neutralized, co-opted, or kept in check through careful management. The psychological and operational infrastructure he built allowed him to maintain order and profitability in an environment that had previously been dominated by chaos, violence, and short-term thinking. Through a combination of strategy, foresight, and human insight, Luciano had transformed the very dynamics of the underworld, positioning himself as the ultimate arbiter of power and influence. In retrospect, this period reveals not just Luciano's rise to dominance but the depth of his genius. He understood that leadership in the criminal world required more than violence. It demanded psychological insight, strategic negotiation, and a comprehensive understanding of human nature. By balancing alliances and rivalries with subtle manipulation, calculated reward, and precise enforcement of loyalty, he built a resilient, adaptable network capable of surviving both internal challenges and external pressures. His approach transformed the underworld into a structured system, where influence was maintained through perception, negotiation, and careful orchestration rather than impulsive displays of force. Through these alliances and rivalries, Luciano demonstrated that power in the mafia was as much about intellect as it was about muscle. He created a model in which strategic foresight, psychological control, and operational discipline combined to establish dominance, minimize conflict, and maximize profitability. The city's criminal landscape would never be the same. The era of chaotic street bosses was ending, replaced by a new order in which one man's vision, intelligence, and cunning reshaped the very nature of organized crime. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire had reached a scale few could comprehend, but with expansion came inevitable threats. Rivalries persisted, law enforcement intensified, and the city's criminal ecosystem became a volatile arena where any misstep could prove fatal. The hidden wars that shaped this period were not always visible to the public. They unfolded in shadowed alleyways, silent backrooms, and whispered conversations, orchestrated by men who understood that perception could be as lethal as bullets. Luciano, ever the strategist, navigated these dangers with calculated foresight, blending diplomacy, subtle intimidation, and occasional violence to maintain his supremacy. The pressure from law enforcement was relentless. Federal and city authorities were increasingly aware of the scale of organized crime, yet the fragmented and secretive nature of Luciano's operations made them difficult to penetrate. Investigations often yielded minimal results, and witnesses were intimidated or disappeared entirely. The very structure that made his empire efficient, the division of labor, compartmentalization of operations, and strict adherence to omerta, also served as a shield against the authorities. Luciano understood that survival in the face of law enforcement required not just evasion but anticipation. He could predict likely targets, anticipate raids, and manipulate perception, ensuring that his movements and decisions remained invisible until he chose to reveal them. Meanwhile, the hidden wars within the underworld intensified. Rival gangs, threatened by Luciano's vision and growing dominance, plotted to reclaim territory or eliminate key figures. These conflicts were rarely public. They were calculated maneuvers of influence, sabotage, and intimidation, designed to weaken opponents without igniting full-scale turf wars. Luciano's response was both strategic and psychological. He used alliances to neutralize threats, offered incentives to turn potential enemies into collaborators, and applied subtle pressure to maintain loyalty. Violence was employed sparingly and deliberately, reserved for situations where it would achieve maximum effect with minimal risk. One of the most significant challenges during this period came from the remnants of the old guard, the established mobsters who resisted his methods and the concept of a centralized criminal council. These figures were entrenched in their ways, accustomed to ruling through fear and reputation rather than organization and strategy. They viewed Luciano's rise as a direct threat to their power and were willing to employ deception, ambush, or assassination attempts to reassert control. Luciano's ability to survive these threats relied on his understanding of human psychology. He anticipated motivations, identified weak links, and orchestrated interventions that neutralized dangers before they could fully materialize. Luciano also understood the importance of intelligence gathering. His network extended beyond visible criminal activity to include informants, sympathetic officials, and loyal operatives embedded in rival factions. This intelligence allowed him to act decisively, to preempt conflicts, and to manipulate situations in his favor. By controlling the flow of information, he maintained an upper hand, often knowing more about potential threats than the threats themselves realized. This level of foresight allowed him to operate with confidence in an environment defined by uncertainty, deception, and high stakes. Internal threats, however, were as perilous as external ones. Ambition, jealousy, and impatience could destabilize alliances, and loyalty was constantly tested under pressure. Luciano's management of these internal dynamics combined psychological acumen with strategic enforcement. Rewards, promotions, and privileges reinforced loyalty, while subtle punishment, social isolation, or removal curtailed potential insubordination. By carefully calibrating incentives and deterrence, he ensured that members understood both the rewards of obedience and the consequences of betrayal. In this way, internal conflicts were mitigated before they escalated into violence, maintaining cohesion within the organization. The hidden wars also included subtle forms of economic warfare. Luciano often disrupted rival operations through strategic manipulation of supply chains, alliances, and labor influence. By controlling key points in bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering, he could weaken adversaries without direct confrontation. This approach demonstrated his ability to combine operational control with psychological pressure, ensuring that rivals understood both their limitations and the consequences of opposition. The ability to wage such hidden wars without attracting public attention or legal scrutiny was a testament to his strategic brilliance. Luciano's survival during this period was further enhanced by his careful attention to optics. He cultivated a reputation as untouchable, both among allies and rivals, leveraging fear, respect, and mystique to maintain authority. Publicly, he remained a shadowy figure, allowing intermediaries to handle operations while he orchestrated from behind the scenes. This duality, visibility through reputation, invisibility in action, provided both protection and influence, making him difficult to target and ensuring that his enemies underestimated the depth of his control. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano recognized that endurance required flexibility. The criminal world was unpredictable. Alliances shifted, law enforcement strategies evolved, and economic conditions changed. He adapted his approach continually, recalibrating tactics, renegotiating partnerships, and adjusting operational priorities. This ability to pivot without appearing weak or indecisive reinforced his authority and allowed the empire to withstand pressures that would have shattered less disciplined organizations. In every sense, his survival was a product of both intellect and instinct, a combination that enabled him to navigate crises with remarkable effectiveness. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's dominance was no longer questioned. He had survived assassination attempts, law enforcement pressure, and the volatile ambitions of rivals. His hidden wars had solidified his control, and his strategic foresight had transformed potential threats into instruments of stability or profit. The network he had built was resilient, interconnected, and adaptable, capable of withstanding both internal and external shocks. Luciano's ability to manage this complex ecosystem of loyalty, rivalry, and fear was unmatched, setting the stage for the next phase of his life, a phase in which law, ambition, and destiny would converge in ways that threatened even the most carefully constructed empires. The lessons of this period reveal the essence of Luciano's genius. He was not merely a gangster. He was a strategist, a psychologist, and a master of perception. He understood that power was not static and that survival required constant vigilance, anticipation, and adaptation. Through hidden wars, calculated alliances, and the intelligent use of fear and respect, Luciano maintained supremacy in a world where most would have been destroyed. This era of unseen battles and intricate maneuvers laid the groundwork for both his eventual downfall and his enduring legend, demonstrating that in the underworld, as in life, intellect and foresight often outweigh brute force. Despite years of careful planning, alliances, and dominance over New York's criminal underworld, Lucky Luciano could not remain invisible forever. By the mid-1930s, law enforcement had intensified its efforts to dismantle organized crime. Federal and city authorities, frustrated by decades of elusive gang leaders and unsolved crimes, saw Luciano as both a symbol and a tangible target. His empire of bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering was enormous, yet his prominence made him increasingly vulnerable. The same visibility that had bolstered his influence among allies and rivals now drew the attention of those determined to bring him to justice. Luciano's arrest was the culmination of years of investigative work, undercover operations, and the exploitation of legal loopholes. Authorities meticulously pieced together evidence, relying on informants, surveillance, and wiretaps to build a case against him. While his organization had previously operated with compartmentalized secrecy, maintaining plausible deniability for him personally, increased pressure and the cooperation of lower-level associates made the empire more penetrable. Law enforcement sought to target not just the crimes but the man at the center, the orchestrator whose intellect, ambition, and ruthlessness had allowed the entire network to flourish. The trial itself became a spectacle, attracting media attention from across the country. Newspapers sensationalized every detail, portraying Luciano as the mastermind of vice, corruption, and violence in America's largest city. Journalists described him as both brilliant and cold-blooded, a figure who seemed untouchable yet now stood exposed under the public gaze. The courtroom became a stage on which not only legal proceedings but also psychological warfare played out. Prosecutors sought to undermine his reputation, using witnesses, intercepted communications, and detailed accounts of criminal activity to construct a narrative of an omnipotent, calculating mob boss. Luciano, ever strategic, approached the trial with the same careful calculation he had applied to building his empire. He understood the importance of perception and the potential power of public sympathy or confusion. He maintained a composed demeanor, projecting confidence and control even as prosecutors painted him as the embodiment of criminality. Every gesture, word, and reaction was measured, signaling both resilience and the implicit threat that despite the court's scrutiny, he remained a figure capable of influence and retribution. His courtroom presence was an extension of the psychological control he had exercised over his network for years. The evidence against Luciano was substantial, yet much of it relied on the testimony of former associates, some coerced, others motivated by self-interest or legal expediency. Witnesses provided accounts of meetings, transactions, and operations, offering glimpses into the otherwise hidden machinery of his empire. Prosecutors aimed to create a narrative in which Luciano's brilliance and ruthlessness were inseparable from his criminal actions, framing him as the puppet master behind a vast network of vice and corruption. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The battle was not just legal but symbolic, a confrontation between an organized underworld and the institutions of law determined to dismantle it. As the trial progressed, the human drama unfolded with all the elements of a cinematic narrative. Loyalty and betrayal intersected, as former allies provided testimony that undermined the very networks Luciano had meticulously built. Yet even in this environment, his psychological acuity remained evident. He anticipated potential pitfalls, managed his reactions, and maintained an aura of authority that complicated the prosecution's attempts to portray him as entirely powerless. The courtroom became a microcosm of his broader empire. Networks of influence, strategic decisions, and psychological leverage all intersecting under intense pressure. The media played a critical role in shaping the public's perception of Luciano during the trial. Reporters portrayed him as a master manipulator, a man whose influence extended into every corner of the city. The public narrative oscillated between fascination and fear, painting him as a brilliant strategist and a dangerous criminal simultaneously. This duality reinforced Luciano's myth, emphasizing the psychological aspect of his power. Even while under scrutiny and facing possible imprisonment, his image as a figure of control and intellect remained largely intact. Ultimately, the verdict and sentencing marked the beginning of Luciano's formal downfall, yet it also highlighted the complexity of his influence. Convicted of compulsory prostitution charges, a charge that allowed authorities to prosecute him effectively without unraveling the entire criminal network, he faced significant prison time. While the sentence was a legal victory for the state, it also underscored the limits of law enforcement in dismantling an empire built on intelligence, secrecy, and psychological mastery. Even behind bars, Luciano's influence and reputation continued to ripple through the underworld, demonstrating the enduring strength of the systems he had constructed. The trial represented more than a legal confrontation. It was a turning point in the narrative of power, loyalty, and downfall. It revealed both the vulnerabilities and the resilience of Luciano's empire, illustrating how the very structures that had allowed him to rise also exposed him to legal attack. The courtroom drama underscored the intersection of ambition, human psychology, and institutional pressure, highlighting how Luciano navigated crises with strategy and foresight, even when facing forces larger than any single gang or individual. In retrospect, the trial was both a culmination and a prelude. It marked the exposure of Luciano's empire to public and legal scrutiny, the unraveling of some alliances, and the crystallization of his reputation as a criminal mastermind. Yet it also demonstrated his capacity to endure and manipulate circumstances beyond immediate control. His strategic mind, psychological insight, and mastery of perception ensured that even in defeat, his legend grew, and the structures he had built remained resilient. The courtroom drama was not merely a legal episode, it was a study in the exercise of power, the management of loyalty and fear, and the enduring complexity of a man who had redefined organized crime. The trial of Lucky Luciano thus stands as one of the defining moments of his life, a vivid illustration of the precarious intersection between crime, law, and human psychology. It marked the start of a period of decline in freedom but also showcased the enduring intelligence, strategy, and foresight that allowed him to maintain influence from even the most constrained circumstances. The courtroom became a battleground not just for justice, but for reputation, perception, and the subtle exercise of power, a battleground Luciano navigated with the same precision that had defined his rise to the pinnacle of the underworld. Even behind the cold, unyielding walls of prison, Lucky Luciano's influence remained far-reaching, a testament to the enduring strength of the systems he had meticulously constructed. For many, imprisonment signals the end of power, the final descent from influence to insignificance. For Luciano, it was merely another arena in which his strategic mind could operate. While his physical freedom was curtailed, the architecture of his empire, built on loyalty, perception, and psychological control, remained largely intact. Through intermediaries, trusted lieutenants, and subtle messaging, he continued to orchestrate operations, demonstrating that true power often resides not in visibility but in the ability to influence outcomes from the shadows. Luciano's time in prison required a recalibration of his methods. The direct oversight and immediate intervention he had exercised outside were no longer possible, so he relied increasingly on trusted lieutenants who understood his vision, adhered to omerta, and could execute orders with precision. The psychological bonds he had cultivated over years became essential tools. Loyalty, carefully reinforced through rewards and mutual benefit, ensured that even without his physical presence, the organization remained cohesive. Associates knew that obedience was not only expected but also strategically advantageous. Deviation could unravel both personal and organizational stability. Luciano's genius lay in creating a network resilient enough to operate independently yet responsive to subtle guidance from its architect. Communication became an art form. Letters, coded messages, and carefully placed intermediaries allowed him to convey directives, maintain oversight, and influence decisions without drawing the attention of prison authorities. Each message was calculated for clarity, authority, and psychological impact, ensuring that his instructions were executed accurately while reinforcing the perception of control. Even the smallest gesture, a strategic favor, a pointed warning, or a carefully timed incentive, carried weight, reminding associates that the man who had built an empire could still shape events from confinement. Luciano's prison strategy also relied heavily on perception. He cultivated an aura of omnipresence, ensuring that even those outside his inner circle believed that he remained in command. Rumors of his continued oversight, subtle manipulations, and strategic interventions circulated widely, reinforcing both fear and respect. This psychological dominance was critical. It minimized challenges, quelled rebellion, and maintained the delicate balance of power within a network that was suddenly more vulnerable due to the absence of its central figure. Luciano understood that control is as much about what people perceive as what is actually executed, a principle he applied with unmatched sophistication. Moreover, Luciano leveraged the prison environment itself to further his influence. He observed behaviors, assessed loyalties, and identified potential threats or opportunities among other inmates and prison staff. Relationships were carefully managed, alliances subtly formed, and leverage quietly accumulated. Every interaction became a potential instrument of influence, a calculated move in a broader strategy to maintain power. Even in confinement, he continued to manipulate the environment to his advantage, demonstrating a capacity for foresight and adaptation that few contemporaries could match. The broader criminal network, meanwhile, continued to thrive under his indirect guidance. Operations in bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering were maintained, expanded, and optimized. Key lieutenants executed strategic decisions that aligned with Luciano's vision, navigating rivalries, mediating disputes, and managing profits with remarkable efficiency. The operational independence of these lieutenants was balanced by psychological tethering. A combination of respect, fear, and shared interest ensured adherence to his overarching strategy. In essence, the empire became a machine capable of self-regulation, yet responsive to subtle interventions from its imprisoned architect. Luciano's ability to exert control from prison also demonstrated the durability of his psychological strategies. The principles of omerta, carefully instilled over years of disciplined enforcement, created a culture of loyalty that transcended immediate supervision. Associates understood the stakes of disobedience and the value of alignment with his vision. Even in his absence, the organizational culture he had cultivated operated as a self-reinforcing system, preserving order, minimizing internal conflict, and protecting the structural integrity of his empire. This capacity to maintain authority despite physical restriction highlighted the sophistication of Luciano's understanding of human behavior and organizational dynamics. Beyond operational management, Luciano's influence from prison extended to strategic positioning within the broader underworld. He remained a central figure in negotiations, disputes, and territorial adjustments, often resolving conflicts without direct confrontation. His ability to mediate, manipulate, and project power ensured that the criminal ecosystem continued to function efficiently, even as external pressures mounted. Law enforcement scrutiny and rival maneuvering were mitigated not merely through secrecy, but through the perception of continuous, omnipresent authority. Luciano had effectively created an empire in which fear, loyalty, and strategic foresight substituted for physical presence, ensuring continuity and control. Yet this period was not without tension. Rival factions, sensing opportunity in his confinement, tested boundaries and challenged authority. Luciano responded with a combination of strategic enforcement and psychological reinforcement. Punishments, carefully targeted interventions, and manipulations of reputation preserved hierarchical stability while deterring insubordination. Every decision reinforced the message that imprisonment did not diminish his capacity for influence, creating a deterrent effect that safeguarded both his position and the cohesion of the network. Ultimately, Luciano's ability to command from behind bars underscored a profound principle. Power is not merely physical but psychological. His empire endured because it was built on systems that could operate independently while remaining tethered to the vision of their architect. Through loyalty, fear, and perception, Luciano maintained a level of control that few outside observers, and even fewer inside, fully appreciated. His time in prison became a demonstration not of decline, but of adaptive genius, a period in which strategy, psychological insight, and organizational design proved more potent than brute force or proximity. In this way, Luciano's years behind bars were not a pause in power but a continuation of influence under constraint. He navigated the dangers of confinement, managed rivalries, and maintained the operational integrity of his empire, demonstrating that true leadership extends beyond the physical domain. Through careful orchestration, psychological mastery, and a resilient network of loyal associates, Luciano ensured that even the walls of a prison could not diminish the reach, intelligence, and authority that had defined his rise. His empire endured, and in many ways, it became stronger, a testament to his vision, discipline, and unmatched understanding of power in all its forms. Luciano's eventual deportation marked a turning point in his life, a dramatic shift from the center of New York's underworld to exile in a foreign land. Unlike many of his contemporaries who fell and disappeared into obscurity, Luciano faced this transition with a strategic mind and psychological resilience honed over decades. Exile did not signal the end of influence, but rather a new arena in which he would navigate power, reputation, and survival. The world outside prison walls was different, yet he approached it with the same combination of calculation, observation, and subtle manipulation that had characterized his rise. The United States deported him to Italy in 1946, a country still reeling from the devastation of World War II. For Luciano, a man who had spent most of his life in New York streets and underground networks, Italy was at once familiar and foreign. The cultural, social, and political landscape had changed, and he was an outsider navigating a complex web of post-war realities. Yet he quickly assessed the terrain, identifying opportunities and threats with the same precision he had applied to managing his empire. Exile required adaptation. Power had to be exercised differently, influence negotiated through new channels, and survival ensured through subtlety rather than overt dominance. Even in exile, Luciano remained in contact with his network in the United States. Trusted lieutenants continued to manage operations, while his guidance, delivered through intermediaries and coded communication, ensured that the empire maintained cohesion and profitability. His absence from the American scene did not diminish his reputation. In fact, it enhanced it. The very act of deportation, intended to weaken him, became a stage upon which his aura of invincibility and strategic foresight was reinforced. Associates and rivals alike recognized that distance did not sever the threads of control he had meticulously woven over decades. Luciano's years in Italy were marked by reflection as well as strategy. Removed from the immediate pressures of managing street-level operations, he had the space to contemplate the arc of his life, the dynamics of power, and the consequences of ambition. His exile offered perspective, a vantage point from which to observe not only the underworld he had shaped but also the forces, law, rivalries, betrayal, that had both constrained and propelled him. It was a period in which he could reconcile the practicalities of survival with the philosophical questions of influence, loyalty, and morality that had long been intertwined with his existence. The post-war environment also provided opportunities for Luciano to extend his influence internationally. With the rebuilding of Europe and the strategic interests of the United States during the Cold War, he was able to engage in negotiations and operations that transcended the traditional boundaries of organized crime. His expertise in logistics, intelligence, and negotiation made him a valuable asset in ways that were both legal and clandestine. Luciano's vision had always been global. Exile became a stage for exercising that vision, demonstrating that his understanding of power was not confined to a city or even a continent, but rather to the complex dynamics of influence, control, and human behavior on a larger scale. Psychologically, exile represented both challenge and liberation. The absence of immediate threats forced him to rely more heavily on intellect and foresight than on physical enforcement. He navigated a world in which his reputation was both an asset and a vulnerability, using perception as a tool to maintain authority while carefully avoiding unnecessary confrontation. Luciano's capacity for adaptation, a hallmark of his rise, allowed him to manage a delicate balance, projecting strength, cultivating networks, and preserving autonomy in a context that could have easily marginalized him. Exile also brought an element of reflection on mortality and legacy. Luciano, having survived countless assassination attempts, legal battles, and internal betrayals, now faced the reality of life in a foreign country with a finite horizon. His thoughts turned to the systems he had built, the men who had followed him, and the enduring structures of power that would survive beyond his personal presence. Unlike the impulsive or short-sighted figures of his era, Luciano seemed to contemplate the long-term consequences of actions, the endurance of influence, and the nature of human loyalty. Exile provided a lens through which he could see the broader arc of his life, both as a criminal strategist and as a man navigating the limits imposed by fate and circumstance. Despite the distance, Luciano's decisions continued to shape events across continents. He was consulted by operatives in the United States, influenced negotiations in international crime networks, and maintained an indirect presence in the political and economic maneuverings that intersected with organized crime. His understanding of human nature, cultivated over decades of operating in high-stakes environments, allowed him to guide outcomes without direct intervention. This period highlighted a critical aspect of his genius: the ability to exercise influence abstractly, through systems, perception, and intermediaries, rather than relying on proximity or direct command. Luciano's exile years were also marked by personal adaptation. He navigated a society recovering from war, managed relationships with new contacts, and adjusted to a life constrained by geography yet expansive in intellectual and strategic possibilities. He understood that survival and influence in this context required discretion, patience, and psychological acuity. Every engagement, negotiation, and decision was calculated to maximize advantage while minimizing exposure, a continuation of the principles that had guided his rise to power decades earlier. In sum, Luciano's exile represents a phase of strategic resilience and philosophical reflection. Stripped of immediate control over the streets of New York but endowed with the clarity of distance, he demonstrated that power transcends proximity, and influence can be maintained through intellect, perception, and subtle orchestration. This period allowed him to consolidate his legacy, observe the world he had shaped, and apply his understanding of human behavior in a context defined by both constraint and opportunity. Luciano's exile was not an end but a transformation, a final test of adaptability, foresight, and enduring mastery of the subtle dynamics of power, loyalty, and survival. Lucky Luciano's influence on organized crime is unparalleled. He transformed the mafia from a fragmented collection of gangs into a structured, disciplined enterprise, creating the commission to manage disputes, coordinate operations, and balance power. This innovation allowed criminal networks to function with efficiency, reduced violence, and enduring loyalty. His genius lay not only in operational control but also in psychological mastery. He understood fear, reward, and reputation as tools to enforce obedience and maintain influence. His methods extended globally, shaping crime networks in Europe, Latin America, and beyond. Centralized control, compartmentalized operations, and strategic alliances became templates for generations of mobsters. The principles of omerta and loyalty he instilled created networks resilient to betrayal, law enforcement, and internal conflict. Even in his absence, Luciano's influence endured, proving that systems of control can outlast individual presence when built on strategy, psychology, and foresight. Luciano's life also became cultural mythology. Media portrayals cemented his image as a brilliant, ruthless mastermind, blending fact with legend. This duality reinforced his psychological influence, ensuring his reputation controlled behavior even without direct action. His legacy is not merely criminal, it is a study in human behavior, organizational strategy, and the enduring exercise of power. Luciano showed that intellect and perception often outweigh brute force, and his empire's resilience demonstrates the timeless value of strategic planning, loyalty management, and psychological insight in any hierarchical system. Lucky Luciano's story is a chronicle of ambition, strategy, and the human capacity for influence. From the streets of New York to exile in Italy, he transformed chaos into order, turning fragmented criminal activity into a disciplined, enduring enterprise. His rise and fall illustrate the delicate interplay between intellect, perception, and power, revealing that true influence is psychological as much as physical. Even in imprisonment and exile, Luciano maintained control through intermediaries, strategic communication, and the perception of omnipresence. His genius lay in understanding human behavior, cultivating loyalty, anticipating betrayal, and leveraging fear and respect to guide outcomes. He operated as a strategist, a psychologist, and a master of perception, proving that the mind can shape events even when freedom is restricted. The contrast between myth and reality defines his legacy. To the public, he was untouchable. In truth, he navigated constant threats, law enforcement pressure, and rival ambitions. Yet his empire endured, and his methods became a blueprint for generations of organized crime worldwide. Luciano's life is both a cautionary tale and a study in power. It demonstrates that influence relies not on brute force alone, but on foresight, psychological insight, and disciplined strategy. Ultimately, Luciano remains an icon not merely of crime, but of leadership, resilience, and strategic mastery. His story closes with reflection. True power transcends physical presence, shaping human behavior and systems that outlast individuals. The myth endures, but so does the lesson, that intellect, psychology, and adaptability are the ultimate instruments of influence.